The thick night air was filled with the silence of the big city, broken only by the distant hum of cars. Snoop Dogg was walking down the deserted street, enjoying a rare moment of calm after a long meeting. His hood was down, and his hands were shoved deeply into the pockets of his sweatshirt. He looked like a perfectly ordinary passerby, but it was this very fact that started the tense incident. The screech of tires broke his thoughts, and a patrol car emerged from the darkness. The policeman behind the wheel glared at Snoop. A moment later, the car stopped and a tall, stocky officer got out. His face was a mixture of suspicion and contempt. "Hey, you, stop," he called rudely, blocking Snoop's path. "What are you doing here at this hour?" Snoop stopped, raised his head, and answered in a calm voice, "Just going home. Is there a problem?" The cop stepped closer, narrowing his eyes as if he saw Snoop's words as a challenge. His gaze slid over the rapper's clothes, lingering on the massive chain around his neck. "Problem?" He grinned. "Yes, a problem. You look like you're not from here. What are you really doing here?" Snoop straightened up, but didn't take a single step back. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked, his voice low but firm. "Violated?" The policeman snorted. "Just passing through, that's all. You probably don't have any ID, do you?" He didn't wait for an answer. The officer approached and, without even waiting for permission, reached into the pockets of Snoop's sweatshirt. "What a neighborhood, and what a contingent," he muttered to himself. His voice was filled with latent aggression, and his hands were deliberately rough as he searched his pockets. "People like you come here a lot," he continued with emphasis on the last word. "It's the same story every time. Drugs, theft, trouble. You don't think that's you?" Snoop Dogg didn't move, though he was seething inside. He knew that any sudden movement could result in more humiliation or even arrest. Passers-by began to stop, whispering about what was happening. "You're a star, aren't you?" the policeman added, suddenly recognizing him. "Do you think that gives you the right to break the law?" "If I've violated, tell me what I've violated," Snoop replied firmly. But the policeman only grinned, clearly enjoying the situation. His intention was obvious: to humiliate, to provoke, to break. But it was at that moment that Snoop decided that this night was not going to end the way this man intended. The story was just beginning, and the tension in the air had already become unbearable. The policeman took a step back, scrutinizing Snoop as if trying to find something suspicious about him. His eyes lingered on the chain, the sneakers, the dark clothes, as if Snoop's very appearance was a crime. "Do you know where you are?" he asked, his voice colder with a tinge of contempt. "This is not your street. This is no place for people like you." Snoop Dogg remained calm, though inside the anger and sense of humiliation rose higher and higher. He knew that every word and every movement could be used against him. "I live nearby," he replied calmly. "I'm just coming home." The policeman bowed his head, pretending to comprehend what he had heard, and then asked sharply, "Nearby? That's funny. Do you have any idea how much houses cost around here? Or are you just walking around?" Snoop knew where the conversation was headed. The questions were becoming more and more provocative, and the policeman's tone more and more demeaning. "Tell me," the officer continued, "where did you get such expensive sneakers? Did you steal them? Or maybe they were gifted by one of your friends?" Passers-by who were watching the situation began to look at each other. Someone took out his cell phone to record, but that didn't stop the policeman. He knew that he had form, power, and preconceived notions of society on his side. Why are you walking around this neighborhood at night? You know what it looks like, don't you?" The officer continued, grinning. "This is no place for your business." At that moment, Snoop looked him straight in the eye. His gaze was calm but firm, like a silent challenge. "I have a right to be here like anyone else," he said. "The law does not prohibit me from walking down the street." The policeman stepped closer, suppressing the space between them. Only a few centimeters separated them now. "Right?" he growled. "Look, kid, you belong in another neighborhood. We don't like your kind here. You're lucky I'm not going to drag you down to the station. Bye." He looked at Snoop like he was trying to pierce him with his gaze, to break him, to make him sag. But the rapper didn't move. He stood like a rock, not giving the cop the satisfaction of humiliation. "Are you looking for something, officer?" he finally asked, his voice drenched in sarcasm but without aggression. This question provoked fury. The policeman had already made no secret of his intention to keep pushing, perhaps in the hope that Snoop would lose control. But the street was coming alive. The lights of the phones flashed in the darkness, capturing every moment. It was clear the incident would not go unnoticed. The policeman was beginning to realize this, but he was not going to back down. The air was heating up. On the horizon loomed a climax that could change the course of events. The crowd began to gather slowly but surely. People passing by stopped their steps, wary of the policeman's sharp shouts. The lights of phones began to flash brighter, reminiscent of the strobe lights on a concert stage. But there was no music here, only stifling silence and the burning heat of injustice. "Papers!" the policeman bellowed, holding out his hand with a sharp movement, as if the order was self-imposed. "Now!" Snoop Dogg sighed. He had no ID. He was just out for a short walk to clear his head after a long day. "I don't have them with me," he replied calmly, trying to ignore the judgmental stares of passers-by. "No?" The policeman laughed mockingly, looking around the crowd. "That's how it is. Of course you don't have any. Why am I not surprised?" His words were accompanied by a disparaging look that seemed to say to everyone present, "I'm right. He's definitely hiding something. Maybe you threw them away? Or were they fake?" The officer continued, slowly walking around Snoop as if he were a trophy animal on display. "Or are you just afraid I'll see who you really are?" The crowd murmured. Some whispered, others silently took notes, but no one interfered. Everyone understood. It was a spectacle of humiliation. The cop took a step closer, almost right up to Snoop, forcing him to step back. But the rapper stood firm, his face stony, his eyes burning with an inner fire. "You think you're special?" the policeman continued, his voice getting louder and louder. "You think your fame gives you the right to break laws? Here on this street, you're just like everyone else. No, worse." These words sounded so loud that some people in the crowd gasped. But the policeman did not stop. His face was contorted with anger. "You know what I like about my job?" he asked suddenly, leaning closer. "I like showing people like you where they belong." Those words hung in the air. For a few seconds it seemed as if the world stood still. Snoop inhaled slowly, feeling the anger inside him become almost unbearable. But he knew he couldn't give this man what he was seeking. "My place," Snoop finally spoke, his voice low and hard as a gong. "My place is where I choose to be, not where you think I belong." The crowd froze. The policeman seemed to lose his temper. His face flushed red. He took a step back, but then, as if recovering from the shock, he attacked again. "You talk too much," he shouted. "Hands on the wall, now!" The crowd began to buzz indignantly. People began to shout, "This is not fair. Why is he doing this? It's racist." But the policeman didn't stop. He pulled Snoop by the shoulder, forcing him to lean against the wall of the nearest building. The rapper's hands were up, at face level, as if he were a criminal caught in the act. "Take it off," shouted someone from the crowd. "Let everyone see it." And the light of the phones flared up with renewed vigor. The cameras recorded every movement, every gesture, every humiliating word spoken by the policeman. "It's your own fault," the officer wheezed, searching Snoop's pockets. "If you didn't want to be treated like that, you shouldn't have looked so suspicious." But this was his last moment of power. The crowd was no longer just watching, it was coming to life. People began to shout louder and louder, their outrage becoming uncontrollable. The policeman sensed that the situation was getting out of control. But Snoop remained motionless. He knew this night was just beginning, but it would have consequences that would change everything. The lights of the telephones directed at the scene became even brighter, and the policeman, noticing this on the contrary, increased the pressure. His voice was harsh and his tone sarcastic, as if the whole scene were an amusing production for him alone. "Suspicious? Look at that," he said, wrapping his arms around Snoop as if in a shop window. "This guy walking down the street at night, no ID, wearing expensive clothes. Tell me, if that's not suspicious, what is?" The crowd began to buzz indignantly, but the policeman didn't even pay attention. He was clearly playing his part to the end. "I know you, people like you," he continued, turning to Snoop again. "Hiding something in those pockets? Drugs, guns, or maybe something worse?" Snoop, who had been standing still until then, turned his head slightly, his gaze impenetrable. He knew that every word or movement now could be used against him. "I have nothing," he answered briefly. "Of course not." The officer grinned, taking a step back, but his eyes flashed with anger. "You think I'm an idiot? You think I don't know what you do in neighborhoods like this? You're looking for trouble." The crowd began to speak louder. Someone shouted out, "It's not true. Leave him alone." The policeman turned sharply to the crowd. "Shut up. This is police business. If you interfere, you'll end up where he is." But fear was already beginning to give way to anger. The people did not retreat. The cameras kept filming, capturing every second of the spectacle. "You're obviously hiding something," the officer said to Snoop again. "Maybe I should call the dogs. They'll find what you're trying to hide." Snoop paused for a moment, then calmly replied, "The only thing to be found here is your preconceived assumptions." These words caused a noticeable silence, as if time had stopped for a moment. The policeman froze, his face contorted with anger. He realized that he was losing control, losing his power, his dominant position. "Is that how you talk to the police?" he hissed. "You think your name or fame means anything to the law?" He cast a glance at the crowd. "Are you all taking notes? All right, let them see this guy's just like the rest of them, a lawbreaker, a liar, a criminal." Snoop Dogg slowly lowered his hands. His voice was quiet but heartfelt. "The only crime here, officer, is your racism." The words, spoken surprisingly calmly, pierced the noise of the crowd like thunder. The people froze. The policeman took a step back, his face frozen in a grimace of embarrassment that he tried to hide under a mask of aggression. But the crowd already knew the truth. Every camera was pointed at him. This wasn't just a street. This was a stage where racism could no longer hide behind uniforms and power. Though the night was far from over, Snoop knew that this was the moment things began to change. The policeman was not going to back down. His face was flushed with anger, and he seemed ready to go to the end to assert his superiority. The crowd around him grew denser and denser, and the outrage and whispers increased. But this only fueled his desire to prove his power. "Against the wall," he ordered sharply, grabbing Snoop roughly by the shoulder and pulling him toward the nearest brick wall. "Hands up, feet shoulder-width apart." Snoop did not resist. He slowly raised his arms, looking straight ahead. His face remained stony, but his eyes reflected a restrained fire. The crowd followed his every move, and the phones kept filming. The policemen began to search him, and every gesture was emphasized in a harsh and humiliating manner. "Of course you're clean," he mumbled, patting Snoop's sides and pockets. "You always do that. Nothing on you, everything hidden somewhere. It's a typical pattern." He slapped Snoop's leg sharply, as if trying to provoke him. "Do you have any idea where you are? This neighborhood is not your type. Or do you think your star life gives you the right to go wherever you want?" The crowd began to murmur. Some shouted, "Stop it! He didn't do anything." But the policeman continued as if he did not hear. His actions became more and more rude, and his comments became openly racist. "Just as I thought, nothing." He paused, grinning savagely. "I guess you're too smart to carry anything around with you." "Of course I am. You're the kind of guy who thinks he can cheat the system." Snoop didn't answer. He just stood against the wall, his hands still raised and his eyes staring straight ahead, as if he knew this scene was going to be more than just a moment of humiliation. "You know what I hate most about people like you?" continued the policeman, addressing not only Snoop, but the entire crowd. "You think you deserve respect. You think you can walk wherever you want, look however you want, and no one will stop you. But the reality is, you will always be suspect." These words elicited gasps of horror from the crowd. Some people could not hold back. "This is racism. Why doesn't anyone do anything?" The policeman looked back at the crowd, his eyes narrowed. He clearly felt the pressure building, but he stubbornly refused to admit that he had gone too far. "You're recording everything, aren't you?" he shouted. "All right, let everyone see me defend our city from people like him." But at that moment, Snoop spoke. His voice was quiet, but so firm that it silenced even the loudest observers. "You're not protecting the city, officer," he said. "You're only protecting your ego, and what you're doing now will be seen by everyone." The policeman froze for a moment. His hand, reaching for Snoop's pocket, stopped. He realized he was losing control of the situation. The crowd was no longer just spectators. They had become witnesses. "Finish it!" shouted someone from the crowd. "We will not forget this." The policeman seemed to realize that it was no longer possible to continue the search, but his face remained twisted with anger. He backed away slowly, gesturing for Snoop to lower his hands. But this was not a victory for the officer. It was only a respite before the truth about that night began to spread. The cameras were turned on, and every second of this humiliating spectacle was already forever etched in people's memories. The crowd froze, waiting for the next move. But the policeman, sensing that he was losing control of the situation, decided to move on to the next stage of his plan. He took a step closer to Snoop, so close that there were barely a few inches between them. "Well, big man," he hissed with a sneer, "you think you've won? You think all this crowd is going to make a difference?" Snoop didn't answer. His eyes stared straight ahead, his face impenetrable. "You're probably used to getting away with everything, aren't you?" The policeman continued. His voice got louder so that the crowd could hear every word. "You know, I know people who deal with people like you every day. Handcuffs, cell, trial. You're not the first one there, and you certainly won't be the last." The policeman leaned closer, almost touching Snoop's shoulder, and said in a whisper, but in a way that could be heard around him, "You're just a criminal. Nothing more, nothing less." Snoop clenched his jaws but continued to remain silent. He knew that every word or movement could be used against him. The crowd around him began to get nervous, their rumblings growing louder. Someone shouted out, "Enough! This is too much!" But the policeman ignored them. He savored his power, feeling the tension in the air heat up. "Say something," he continued, his tone mocking. "What? Did you swallow your tongue? Do you want me to help you? Or are you just afraid?" The policeman suddenly raised his hand, making a sharp gesture as if he were going to grab Snoop. The crowd gasped. The cameras captured the moment. But Snoop remained motionless. His calmness was like a wall against which all the officers' provocations crashed. "That's it." The policeman grinned, his face contorted with irritation. "You think not talking makes you better? No, boy. It only proves you're a coward." He turned sharply to the crowd, pointing a finger at Snoop. "Look at him. Big star, huh? But in reality, just a thief, just a lowlife who got caught in the right place at the right time." The crowd began making an indignant noise, shouting words in defense of Snoop. But the policeman didn't stop. His anger grew like an avalanche, and he addressed the rapper again. "Come on," he said, taking a step back and squaring his shoulders. "Hit me, or say something mean. Give me a reason to do what I want." Snoop turned his head, his gaze cold and hard as ice. "If you want to show who's boss, officer," he said quietly but with unshakable confidence, "you've already lost." Those words sounded like a challenge, but not an aggressive one. It was a challenge that could not be ignored. The crowd roared, cheering Snoop on. The policeman froze, his face contorted with anger. He had been sure he could provoke the rapper, but now he realized he was not just a man, but a force that could not be broken by words or actions. The crowd began to shout louder and louder, "Leave him alone! He's done nothing." The policeman realized he had gone too far. He turned around, his eyes darting between the cameras that recorded his every move. But he didn't want to back down. The tension in the air had peaked, and it seemed that any movement could be the spark for an explosion. But Snoop remained motionless. His silent resistance was a symbol that even in the face of humiliation and racism, dignity and inner strength can be maintained. The silence, interrupted only by the roar of the crowd, seemed louder than any shout. The policeman stood in front of Snoop, his hand trembling slightly, his fingers still clenched threateningly into a fist. But something about this moment had changed. The sense of control he had so diligently maintained was beginning to slip away. Snoop slowly lowered his arms. His movements were calm, almost majestic, as if he knew the whole world was now watching. The crowd froze, and the cameras continued to record every second. The policeman took a step back, suddenly feeling that something in this situation was no longer within his control. Snoop spoke. His voice was deep, steady, and confident. Each word, spoken with an almost frightening calmness, sounded louder than any of the policeman's shouts. "Officer," he began, looking directly into his opponent's eyes, "you have the right to demand documents if you suspect a crime has been committed. But as far as I understand, your only suspicion is based on the way I look. The cop opened his mouth to interrupt, but Snoop raised his hand, stopping him, and continued. "You searched me. You found nothing. You tried to provoke me, but I gave you no reason. Now tell me, what are you going to do next?" These words hung in the air like thunder. The crowd grew louder. People began to applaud, shouting words of encouragement. The policeman was clearly confused. He had not expected such a reaction. He was used to his authority not being challenged. "You have no right to talk to me like that," he shouted, but his voice didn't sound so confident anymore. Snoop tilted his head slightly, his face remaining calm. "Respect, officer," he said. "You're talking about a right. I have every right to be here, and you know it, just like I know my rights." He took a step forward, and the policeman involuntarily flinched as if he had lost his balance. "Under the Constitution," Snoop continued, now addressing not only the policeman but the crowd as well, "I have the right to travel freely. I have the right to be free from unreasonable detention, and I have the right to respect like any other citizen." The crowd began to applaud. Some shouted, "Yes, you're right. Tell him." The policeman looked confused. His usual tactics of humiliation and suppression were not working. Moreover, it had turned against him. "It's not that easy." He tried to justify himself, raising his hands in a defensive gesture. You're acting suspicious." Snoop raised an eyebrow. His voice was calm, but there was a challenge in it. "Suspicious?" he interjected. "Suspicious because I'm walking down the street at night? Or suspicious because I'm black?" The words sounded like a blow. The crowd gasped, then shouts of approval began. The cop opened his mouth again, but now the words seemed empty, meaningless. He looked at the crowd, at the cameras, at Snoop's still body, and realized that any move he made would only make things worse. "I don't have to explain it," he shouted, but his voice didn't sound so confident anymore. Snoop took another step forward. His gaze was hard, but there was no aggression in it, only unyielding confidence. "You have an obligation," he said. "You have a duty to protect and serve, but instead you use your power to humiliate. And you know what the best part is? You do it in front of the cameras, in front of the world." The policeman turned around nervously. He realized he was the center of attention. His face turned pale. The crowd applauded, shouting words of encouragement to Snoop, and some had already started calling hotlines to report what was happening. Snoop turned to the crowd, looked at the people who stood behind him. "We are all witnesses here," he said loudly, "witnesses to the way the system works. But we can change it." His words elicited a loud roar of approval. People raised their hands, applauded, shouted words of encouragement. The policeman, who a moment ago had been in complete command of the situation, now looked completely lost. He muttered something, took a step back, and finally turned abruptly, heading for his car. The crowd began to applaud louder. Snoop stood watching the patrol car drive away, leaving only the sounds of fading sirens behind him. That night was far from an ordinary outing. It had become a symbol of something bigger. And even though Snoop knew the fight wasn't over, he felt that this small victory was a step toward a big change. As the policeman disappeared from sight, the crowd around Snoop began to come to life. People applauded, shouted their approval, but he remained motionless, still standing in the same place. It wasn't a triumphant hero's return, it was a moment of deep reflection and realization that the struggle had just begun. The crowd crowded closer, people asking questions, offering help, some even trying to shake his hand. But Snoop held up his palm, gesturing for silence. He knew that it was not emotion that mattered now, but how this moment would be perceived and understood. "Thank you to everyone who stayed, who recorded, who supported," he said, his voice deep and confident, overpowering the noise around him. "But I want you to understand, this is not about what happened to me. This is about what's happening to us." These words hung in the air, absorbing the attention of everyone present. People froze, the cameras continued filming, but now not for the sake of sensation, but for the sake of truth, which sounded in every word of the rapper. "What you saw," he continued, "is not just a bug in the system. It is at its core. It is what thousands of people who don't bear my name, who don't have my resources, who don't have cameras to record the truth, are facing." His words were drenched in anger, but it was an anger that came from deep within, curbed and directed. The crowd listened without interrupting. Even the noise of passing cars seemed distant, unimportant. "I stood here," he said, "because I knew that if I had responded to the provocation, if I had taken even a step toward aggression, I would not only be blamed, but destroyed." Snoop paused, looking around at the faces of the people gathered around him. His words traveled from one to the next like a current, making them think about their own role in what was happening. "We've all seen one man here try to use his power to humiliate another," he continued. "But you know what else we've seen? We have seen how resistance can be powerful, even if it is not expressed with fists." His voice began to gain strength. He was no longer just speaking. He was speaking to the hearts of everyone who listened. "I want each and every one of you to understand. It doesn't end here," he said. "This video, these witnesses, this moment, it all has to be part of something bigger. Because if we let it go, if we let it stay just a story about Snoop Dogg, we're not going to change anything." The crowd began to buzz, shouting words of encouragement. People raised their hands in solidarity. Some were already uploading videos to social media, turning this moment into more than just an incident on the street. But even in that support, Snoop felt the weight of the situation. He knew that for many of those present, this moment would be a reminder, but not reality, because they had never experienced something like this personally. He realized that this night would be followed by hundreds of others, where someone would not be able to stay calm, where provocation would end in tragedy. "It's not just my fight," he said, his voice shaky, but it quickly regained its strength. "This is our fight. If you think this is just an incident, you're not seeing the big picture." He lowered his head for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts, and then raised his eyes to the crowd. "I'm not going to keep quiet, and neither should you. We can change this, but only together." These words elicited a resounding "yes" from the crowd. People started shouting his name, raising their fists up in solidarity. Someone shouted out, "We're with you, Snoop!" But he gestured them to stop, showing that this was not the time for triumph. "Not with me," he said. "With everyone who doesn't have the ability to stand here and speak for themselves. With everyone you don't even know, whose story will never be heard." His words carried not only pain and anger, but also hope. Hope that the world could be a better place if people would stop being mere bystanders and start acting. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but each person left with the feeling that they had been part of something important. The cameras were still rolling, the internet was already flooded with video, and the policeman hiding in his car was a symbol that the old system was cracking at the seams. Snoop stayed where he was for a few more minutes, looking up into the night sky. He knew this was just the beginning. The pressure he had experienced this night had been heavy, but he had endured. And now that strength wasn't just his. It belonged to everyone who was near and heard his voice. The silence that followed Snoop's speech was deafening. The cop, now standing a little farther away, looked like all his plans had just been ruined. His confidence, with which he had tried to humiliate the rapper and show his authority, melted under the light of dozens of phones pointed directly at him. The crowd was no longer just a witness. It became an active participant, and it completely changed the balance of power. The policeman took a few steps back, as if trying to realize how his usual scenario had gone awry. He looked back at the crowd, now not as spectators but as judges. His breathing quickened, his face flushed. For a moment he looked as if he were ready to make excuses, but then, as if remembering his uniform and status, he tried to pull himself together. "Go away," he said hoarsely, waving his hand toward the crowd. "There's nothing of interest here." But the people didn't move. On the contrary, there were more and more of them. Someone had already managed to send the video to social networks, and news of what was happening began to spread quickly. People in the crowd whispered, checking their phones. "It's already on Twitter. Look how many views it's gotten." The policeman tried to make his voice firmer. "I said break it up. This is police work, and it's none of your business." But his words sounded hollow. People knew that this was not a job, but an attempt to use power to humiliate a man who, unfortunately for him, turned out to be not only famous but also strong in spirit. Snoop, who had been standing motionless all this time, now stepped forward. The crowd parted before him, as if creating a corridor. He stepped closer to the policeman, but not too close that he didn't feel threatened. "Officer," he said, his voice calm but sounding firm, "do you want everyone to disperse? Then perhaps you should start." These words caused waves of whispers in the crowd. People understood that it was not just a challenge but a skillful move that left the policeman with no options. He gritted his teeth, but didn't say anything. "You thought you could use your power against me?" Snoop continued, keeping his eyes on the policeman. "But look around you. You've lost control. People aren't afraid anymore." The policeman froze. He turned around, as if checking to see if it was true, and saw that all the cameras were pointed at him. He was no longer the master of the situation. He was now the main antagonist, the protagonist of a video that had already gone viral. "You don't understand," he muttered, but his voice sounded shaky. "Oh, I understand," Snoop interrupted him. "I realize you're used to doing this with people who don't have a voice. But tonight, we have not only a voice, we have eyes too." The crowd applauded, their support so loud that it overrode all the policeman's attempts to say anything. He raised his hand again, trying to quiet them, but it only increased the shouting. "Go away," shouted someone in the crowd. "Apologize," added another. The policeman realized that the situation was becoming catastrophic. His face turned pale and his hand instinctively reached for the radio. Perhaps he wanted to call for backup, but he knew that would only make matters worse. Any additional officer would become part of this story that was already out of his control. "I don't have to explain anything," he muttered, but he didn't even believe his own words. Snoop stepped closer, his face still calm, but his eyes read steely determination. "You may not have to explain," he said, "but I assure you the world will be asking." The policeman took another step back, now standing at the edge of the crowd. People continued to record his every gesture. He knew that any movement, any word could become a headline, a meme, or further proof that he was wrong. "Do you want to leave this situation?" Snoop said, his voice as loud as a final chord. "Then make the right choice." The policeman stopped, then slowly turned and walked toward his car. His steps were heavy, his back bent, as if under the weight of realizing his mistake. The crowd began to applaud, but in that applause there was not jubilation, but a sense of triumph of justice. As the policeman's car drove away, Snoop turned to the men. "It's not just my victory," he said. "This is our victory. Don't let anyone take away your power. Never." The crowd applauded again, louder this time, their voices blending into a single sound of support. Snoop knew this was just the beginning, but he felt he had taken a step in the right direction. The next morning, the world woke up different. The video recorded on that night's street spread at the speed of wildfire. Every social media platform was filled with clips, comments, memes, and posts discussing not only the Snoop Dogg situation, but also the broader question, how long will people tolerate this behavior? The hashtag #JusticeForAll became the #1 trend on Twitter, and Snoop's phrase, "We can change it, but only together," became the slogan of millions. Memes of his words went viral everywhere, from meme pages to serious analysis sites. People shared videos of his cold-blooded reaction, noting how important it is to stay calm in such situations. The repercussions were not only virtual, however. Crowds began to gather in the streets to protest racism in the police force. People held placards with Snoop's image and inscriptions. "Dignity is our strength," "The system must change," and "Justice for all." The media wasn't left out either. Television shows, podcasts, and blogs all discussed the incident. The top news stories of the day were about the officer who used his power to humiliate and how his attempt turned into a debacle. The city's police department released an official statement promising to launch an internal investigation. "We will review the incident to see if our employees' actions met the standards," they said. But the public was not enough. People demanded not just investigation, but reform. Snoop Dogg himself avoided comment for the first few days. He wanted the video to speak for itself, for the world to discuss not him, but the essence of the problem. But when the media pressure became unbearable, he agreed to an interview. "It's not about me," he said on a major television program. "It's about anyone who faces this every day. If I wasn't who I am, who knows how it would have ended? It's scary, but it's reality." His words have touched millions. His composure, his confidence, and his willingness to use his voice to advocate for others became a role model. People began to see him not only as a musician, but as a leader who could inspire change. As for the officer, the consequences for him were devastating. His name was publicized, his actions condemned by thousands of people. The videotape of his behavior became a symbol of everything that is wrong with the system. He was suspended from the force, but the public demanded more. "This is not just a random incident," human rights activists said. "It is the consequence of a culture of impunity in the police." Under pressure from the community and activists, a broader audit of the police department was launched. Politicians began pushing bills aimed at police reform and eliminating racial bias. But perhaps the most important consequence was that people began to speak up. Those who had previously been afraid to raise their voices felt supported. Snoop's story became a catalyst for many others who had previously been silent about their experiences. People shared their stories, and movements for justice and equality began to gain new momentum. schools and universities began holding discussions about racism and power. On social media, people shared educational materials inspired by Snoop's words and actions. His speech on the street that night became part of civic activism textbooks. Snoop Dogg didn't stop there. He created a foundation to provide legal assistance to those facing injustice. He became a voice that no one could ignore. His interviews, speeches, and participation in protests inspired people to fight for justice. "We must not forget that strength lies in unity," he said. "Each of us can be part of the change if we choose not to be silent." A few months have passed and a lot has changed. The city's police department was forced to conduct a massive recertification of its officers. Police reform bills began to pass at the local and federal levels. Most importantly, people were no longer afraid to speak up. Snoop knew the struggle was far from over, but this moment was proof to him that the power of an individual, preserved under pressure, can change the world. His story has remained in the hearts of millions as a reminder that dignity and confidence can break down even the strongest walls of injustice. This was not just a victory. It was a new phase in the fight for equality and justice, and Snoop Dogg became its symbol. Friends, write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you experienced this kind of injustice or racism in your life? Your stories are incredibly important to us. They help us understand how we can fight together for justice and equality. We sincerely appreciate each and every one of you, your support and your votes. Thank you for being with us. If this story touched you or made you think, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like. It helps us share important stories like this with as many people as possible. May your day be filled with nothing but kindness and positivity.